what we're seeing now is Russia trying one more technique, but it's never worked. The Europeans are not scared. Aggressive set of remarks. Usually Russia tends to become more aggressive in its rhetoric when it's not doing so well on the battlefield. And Russian forces have not been doing well. They have not been advancing in Ukraine. They had some momentum earlier that's dissipated now. And the Europeans are stepping up their support for Ukraine. So Lavrov's comment, for example, about decisive response, if there's aggression, I think the Russians are really concerned that Ukraine is going to get new and more, some better weapons, and Ukraine might be able, for example, to strike the Russian aircraft that launched these deadly glide bombs against civilian targets in Russia.
Right. We've been sort of toying with this idea that that Russia would... Sergei Lavrov himself said that Russia wouldn't accept the shooting down of Russian planes over Russian airspace. Julie Kirkbride, who was with us earlier, pointed out that seems ridiculous because that isn't going to happen. What could, of course, happen, as we sort of alluded to there, is the idea of NATO weapons being used to shoot down Russian planes over Russia-contested airspace. Would that pass the threshold?
It's hard to know about these sorts of things. I think the Russians are not worried so much about NATO aircraft now. They're worried about Ukrainian aircraft, including U.S.-made F-16s, which several allies have provided to Ukraine. They are getting more and better weapons, and so they could pose a greater threat to Russian aircraft, including the Russian aircraft flying behind the line. Russian aircraft don't venture over the line into Ukraine because the Ukrainian air defenses are really quite strong.
Mm. What do you think is happening in Denmark's airspace this weekend?
We have to look at that in light of the drones, the unarmed drones that Russia sent into Poland, the Russian aircraft that have been overflying Estonia out into the Baltic Sea. It looks like Russia is trying to, let's say, scare Western European countries, NATO allies, from getting more involved in Ukraine, as Russia sees that the Europeans are stepping up their support. For example, Denmark is providing a lot more money now to Ukraine to help Ukraine defense industry production. The Poles have been really strong in supporting Ukraine all the way through. So I think what we're seeing is Russians are concerned that while the United States might step away from the fighting, as President Trump hinted recently, we might see the Europeans doing more and more, and the Russians are worried about that because the Europeans have been taking a tougher line on Russia than has the United States.
Right, so flying drones into Russian airspace, then an act of intimidation, I think is perhaps the way we describe it. Is that likely to work?
Well, the Ukrainians have been flying drones hundreds of kilometers into Russia, attacking mainly oil refineries. And that, of course, has harmed Russian production of petroleum products, which can be used to prosecute the war in Ukraine. So that's been going on for some months now. There's no prospect that the NATO allies are going to be flying drones into Russia. They don't need to do that. The Ukrainians are doing an excellent job of that themselves.
But are they going to be intimidated by Russia flying drones into their airspace? And actually, let's just talk more specifically about, say, Poland, Denmark in this case, and maybe the public, the Danish public, who say, do you know what, this is a bit too close to home. Russia are a bit too close over the top of my head here. I'd rather we stepped away from this fight.
Actually, this most recent threat with the drones is pretty minor compared to some of the Russian threats in the past. From the beginning of the war, President Putin, for example, and his allies have been making nuclear threats, threatening that there could be a nuclear conflict in Ukraine as a result of prosecuting the war. And the Europeans have never become scared. The Europeans have continued to step up their support for Ukraine, and they're doing that now. Russia, for a long time, including the Soviet period, has always thought that it could scare Europeans. Russia never fully, and still does not fully, respect the strength and integrity of European countries. And so what we're seeing now is Russia trying one more technique, but it's never worked. The Europeans are not scared.
And we're hearing tonight about a British wall of drones, William, to protect NATO airspace. That would be a large undertaking, but you assume it would be, I suppose, the sort of right move for the NATO border at the moment.
Well, it would depend on what kind of wall this would be, but it is clear now that NATO needs to be able to have more cost-effective ways to deal with Russian drones. For example, the Poles shot down 4 of the recent drones of the 19 that came in, but they use expensive air-to-air missiles to do that. So just like the Ukrainians have been turning back to some World War II machine guns on tops of buildings to strike drones because they need more cost-effective ways to do that. And now Ukrainians are developing anti-air drones that can attack incoming attacking drones. So the Europeans, too, the NATO allies, really need to develop more cost-effective means to deal with drones. And that's something that I think the Europeans are going to work on urgently.
Quite the about turn from Donald Trump this week on Ukraine, William, saying that he thinks that Ukraine could actually gain all of its territory back now. What changed?
Well, a couple of things. One, the Russian military momentum that seemed to be existing a couple of months ago, now that's pulled back. The Russians are stalled on the battlefield, and really over the last 3 years, they've mostly been stalled in eastern Ukraine. They've gained very little territory. But another aspect of what President Trump said was that Europeans and Ukraine could do this. It's kind of a hint that they may not need the United States and that he might pull the United States back. Now, the United States Defense Department is about to announce a new national defense strategy, which is going to emphasize defense of the homeland in the Western Hemisphere. That means less emphasis, relatively speaking, on Europe, Middle East, and perhaps even less emphasis on China. So I think the Europeans are seeing that, and so they're stepping forward more as they're concerned that the United States might step back further.
Right, I see. Front page of the Sunday Times tomorrow, William, considers the identities of the Russian commanders who led the troops that were involved in the Bucha massacre. Obviously horrendous moment. Many people killed. A massacre there in March 2022. They included the top general who led the army at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine, other generals as well, and colonels who were in charge of the soldiers who killed people accused of crimes including murder, torture, rape. Why does their identity, knowing who they are, matter?
Well, it's going to be important as when this war is over or major combat operations end, there's going to be a serious question about war crimes accountability for Russian war crimes. So, for example, Russian drones are attacking civilian targets in Ukraine, whereas Ukrainian drones attack military targets and war-supporting industries in Russia. So the Russians are really running a high risk of let's say, infringing war crimes legislation or war crime standards. So I think identifying folks, for example, in that first massacre in Bucha, that's going to be a significant issue for war crimes later. In the Nuremberg trials after World War II, only 199 top Nazis were prosecuted. But now in this war, there are so many examples of cell phone video and drone video and things like that, that accountability for war crimes can be, let's say, seen at a much lower level than was the case in World War II. So commanders, for example, in Bucha could be vulnerable.